President, I come to the floor today to give some remarks that I give about every 2 years, I guess, when the Senate reconvenes for a new Congress. And now this is a new Congress. And so once again, I come here to point out that we need to make some changes in the way we operate. I've been in this body for 28 years. I'm currently 8th in seniority. Well, that's as soon as Senator Kerry becomes Secretary of State, I'll be 7th in seniority. I'm proud and honored to represent the great state of Iowa. I'm proud to be a United States Senator to serve in this illustrious body. I have been in the majority and the minority, I think up to 5 times in the Senate. Before that, I served 10 years in the House. I love this Senate. It is a wonderful institution. It is, as envisioned by our founders, the Senate at times have been frustratingly slow to encompass the changes necessary for the smooth functioning of our country. I mention in particular the long struggle for civil rights and how that was held up by a small minority, which happened to be in my party, by the way, at that time. But nonetheless, the Senate, through the years, has really been the chamber that takes a long and hard look at legislation, where we have the right to amend, where we have the right to discuss and to embark upon discourse on legislation in a manner that allows even the smallest state, to be able to be represented as much as a large state. Not true in the body that both the occupant of the chair and I used to serve in the House, because there, as you know, large states tend to dominate because they've got most of the members. But here, a senator from Connecticut is just as important as a senator from California or a senator from Iowa, or let's see, what's the least populous state? Wyoming, I think, maybe, or Alaska, is equal to a senator from New York or Florida or Texas or California. So this has been the great equalizing body. And so, having served here for this time, I think I have some perspective on this Senate. As I said, at its best, this Senate is where our great American experience in democratic self-government most fully manifests itself. It's in this body that the American people, through their elected officials, can come together collectively to debate, to deliberate, and to address the great issues of our time. Throughout our nation's history, it has done so. In the nearly quarter century that I've been here, well, wait, now it's 28 years I've been here, so it's over a quarter of a century, the rights of Americans have been expanded. Americans with disabilities. We've ensured health insurance for millions of Americans. In the early 1990s, we voted here on a course to eliminate the national debt within a generation, and we were on our way to do that. It's because of my great reverence for this institution, my love for our country, that I come to the floor today. One does not need to read the abysmal approval ratings of Congress to know that Americans are fed up and angry with this broken government. In too many critical areas, people see a Congress that's riven with dysfunction. Citizens see their legislature going from manufactured crisis to manufactured crisis. They see a legislature here that is simply unable to respond effectively to the most urgent challenges of our time. Of course, there are myriads of reasons for this gridlock: increased partisanship, a decline in civility and comity, too much power, I believe, in the hands of special interest groups, a polarizing instant news media, and I might add the increasing time demands on all of us here involved in raising large amounts of money to run for re-election. But make no mistake, a principal cause of dysfunction here in the Senate is the rampant abuse of the filibuster. And it's long past time to make the Senate a more functional body, one that's better able, again, as I said, to respond to our nation's challenges. The fact is, Mr. President, I am not a Johnny-come-lately to filibuster reform. In January of 1995, When I was in the minority, I might add, I first introduced legislation to reform the filibuster. And we got a vote on it. Obviously, we didn't win. But I made my points then, and I got engaged in a very, very good debate with Senator Byrd at that time in 1995. You can read it in the record. I think it's probably about, that's January the 8th, if I'm not mistaken, of 1995. At that time, I introduced the resolution because, as I said, I saw an arms race in which each side would simply escalate the use of the filibuster and abuse procedural tools to the point where we just ceased to function here in the Senate. I said that at the time. I said, you know, what happens is that when the Democrats are in the minority, they abuse the filibuster against the Republicans. Then when the Republicans become the minority, they say, well, you Democrats did it to us 20 times, we'll do it to them 30 times. Then when it switches again and the Democrats get in the minority, they say, well, Republicans did it to us 30 times, we'll do it to them 50 times, we'll teach them a lesson. And on and on the arms race has escalated. I said at the time, we might get to a point where this body simply could not function, and sadly, that is what happened. And that's why 18 years after I first introduced my proposal, I believe reform has never been more urgent and necessary. Mr. President, the minority leader has stated that reformers advocate, quote, a fundamental change to the way the Senate operates. To the contrary, it is the abuse of the filibuster, not the reforms being advocated, that has fundamentally changed the character of this body and our entire system of government. Again, as I will point out now, and I will point out repeatedly during my remarks, Democrats are not guiltless in this regard by any means. But the real power grab and the real abuse has come about when the Republicans, who have abused this tool, one that was used sparingly for nearly 200 years. And what has happened is that effective control of the Senate and of public policy has been turned over to the minority, not to the majority who have been elected by the American people. In many cases, those who are warning of a fundamental change to the nature and culture of the Senate are really ones who have already carried out a revolutionary change. Those of us who are seeking to reform the filibuster are not the ones that are doing a nuclear option or blowing the Senate up. Those who have abused the filibuster are the ones who have already changed the character of the Senate. What we're trying to do is to restore some functionality to the Senate so that the Senate can operate with due regard for the rights of the minority, and I'll talk about that more in a moment. The minority leader has recently called the filibuster, quote, near sacred, quote, near sacred. But I'm sorry, he could not be more incorrect. The notion that 60 votes are required to pass any measure or confirm any nominee is not in the Constitution, and until recently would have been considered a ludicrous idea, flying in the face of any definition of government by democracy. Far from considering the filibuster, quote, near sacred, it is safe to say that the founders would have considered a supermajority requirement sacrilegious. After all, they experimented with a supermajority requirement under the Articles of Confederation, and it was expressly rejected in the Constitution because the framers believed it had proven unworkable. That's right, the Articles of Confederation basically had a supermajority requirement. And they found that that didn't work. And that's why, as I will mention in a moment also, that the framers of the Constitution set out explicitly 5 different times that this Senate requires a supermajority. Now, you would have thought that if they wanted a supermajority for everything, they would have said so. No, they specified treaties, impeachments, expelling a member. Those require a supermajority, expressly spelled out in the Constitution. Now, the filibuster was once a tool used only in the rarest of instances, most shamefully, as I said earlier, to block critical civil rights legislation. But across the entire 19th century, there were only 23 filibusters in 100 years. From 1917, when the Senate first adopted rules to end filibusters, until 1969, there were fewer than 50 during all those years. Less than one filibuster a year. In his 6 years as Majority Leader, Lyndon Johnson only faced one filibuster. According to one study, in the 1960s, just 8% of major bills were filibustered. And think about all the legislation that was passed. Civil Rights, Voting Rights Act, Medicare, Medicaid, Older Americans Act, Pell Grants, Higher Education Act, Elementary and Secondary Education Act. Think of all the legislation passed in the 1970s. Just 8% were filibustered. In contrast, since 2007, when Democrats regained control of the Senate, there have been over 380 motions to end filibusters. 380. And this does not even include the countless bills and nominees in which the majority has not even tried to obtain cloture, either because of a lack of time or because we knew it would be fruitless. The fact is, for the first time in history, on almost a daily basis, the minority, and in many cases just one senator, routinely is able to and does use the threat of a filibuster to stop bills from even coming to the floor for debate and amendment. Unfortunately, moreover, because of outdated rules, today an actual filibuster rarely occurs. Too often it's just merely the threat of a filibuster, and that's the end of it. It's not debated or anything. So let's get beyond the outrageous idea that Democrats, in proposing rules reform, would be initiating a revolution. In actuality, the changes that are seriously under discussion right now are simply a modest reaction to decades of escalating warfare, which has culminated in 6 years of unrelenting minority obstructionism. Now, because I feel so passionately that reform is so badly needed, I fully support the common sense proposals from Senators Merkley and Senator Udall. Their proposals would simply require the minority to actually filibuster, to actually debate, meaning a senator would have to come to the floor, explain his or her opposition, or offer his or her views on how a bill could be improved. Under the proposed reform, senators would have to actually make arguments, debate, and deliberate. Senators would have to obstruct in public and be held accountable for that obstructionism. Now, perhaps this is such a common sense reform because it is. Republicans who have come to the floor have not addressed why they oppose rules which would require mere transparency. The Republicans have failed to explain to this body or to the public why a minority. Why a minority? Again, the group that the public chose not to govern here. Why should they be able to kill a bill or a nominee by stealth? Republicans have failed to explain why they oppose more debate and more deliberation. Why do they oppose more debate, more deliberation, which is puzzling, given that they profess that their sincere concerns are animated by a desire to foster debate and deliberation. But that's not what's happening. In stealth, they oppose a bill, they don't come to the floor, they fail to defend why they don't even do that, why they won't even come to the floor and speak. Instead, Republican after Republican has come to the floor and denounced what they claim are Democratic efforts to eliminate the filibuster and to, in their words, quote, fundamentally change, end quote, this body. Well, the fact is they're attacking the wrong plan. The truth is, under the reform proposed either by Senator Udall or Merkley or one they have together, or even under my proposal, the filibuster would still be a tool. Filibuster would still be a tool. 60 votes would be needed to enact a measure or confirm a nominee. And now under their proposal, it would still require 60 votes. Under my proposal, as I first laid out in this body in 1995, I said, that, sure, okay, on the first vote, after you've got the cloture petition filed, the first vote would require 60 votes. If you didn't have 60 votes, you'd have to wait 3 days, file another cloture petition, then you need 57 votes. If you didn't get 57, you have to file another cloture petition, wait 3 days, need 54 votes. If you didn't get that, you could file another cloture petition, wait 3 days, then you need 51 votes. Under this proposal that I have worked out with other groups and other people over the last almost 20 years, The fact is, the filibuster could be used for what it was intended: slow things down. I believe the Senate ought to be a place where we slow things down. But it shouldn't be a place where just a few senators can kill a bill, where the filibuster is used not to slow things down, but is absolutely used to kill a bill. What I have proposed, there would be a period of time, actually up to about 16 days, which someone could slow a bill down, but eventually the majority would be able to act. I mean, what a revolutionary idea. The majority should be able to prevail. I mean, think about our own elections. I guess maybe you could extend it further and say, well, it's not enough to get 51% or you get the majority of the votes, you got to get 60%. If you don't get that, you don't take office. What a revolutionary idea that somehow the majority ought to be able to move legislation. But I also agree that there ought to be the rights of the minority. The rights of the minority to debate, discuss, amend legislation. Now again, the majority, after ample debate and deliberation, has the power to govern, to enact the agenda the voters voted for, and to be held accountable at the ballot box. I guess, in other words, I fundamentally believe in democracy. Maybe that's just a failing on my part. I just fundamentally believe that the majority should rule with respect for rights of the minority. Now, as I've noted, a revolution has already occurred in the Senate in recent years. Never before in the history of this Senate was it accepted that a 60-vote threshold was required for everything. Now, this did not occur through a constitutional amendment or through any great public debate. Rather, because of the abuse of the filibuster, the minority party has assumed for itself absolute and virtually unchecked veto power over all legislation, over any executive branch nominee, no matter how insignificant the position, over all judges, no matter how uncontroversial. In other words, because of the filibuster, even when a party has been resoundingly repudiated at the polls, that party retains the power to prevent the majority from governing and carrying out the agenda that the public elected it to implement. In this regard, over 380 filibusters is not some cold statistic. Each filibuster represents a minority of senators, sometimes just a mere handful, preventing the majority of the people's representatives from governing. As just one example, Republicans repeatedly filibustered motions to proceed to legislation that would require more disclosure of campaign donations. The Disclose Act is what it was called. A substantial majority of senators supported the bill. Polling showed that 80% of the public believed the Supreme Court's decision in Citizens United was wrong, that we needed to know more disclosure of campaign contributions. Yet a small minority of senators were able to prevent the bill from even being debated on the floor of the Senate, let alone receiving an up or down vote. That's just one example. In the last two Congresses, consider just some of the measures blocked by the minority, measures that received majority support on a cloture vote. The DREAM Act, Bring Jobs Home Act, Small Business Jobs and Tax Relief Act, Paying Fair Share Act of 2012, Repeal Big Oil Tax Subsidies Act, Teachers and First Responders Back to Work Act, American Jobs Act of 2011, Public Safety Employer-Employee Cooperation Act, Paycheck Fairness Act, Creating American Jobs and Ending Offshoring Act. Now again, it's not that the bill was filibustered. The right to even debate these bills and vote on them was filibustered. One thing, if you're on the bill and they filibustered, no, we couldn't even debate it. Even though a majority of senators voted for cloture. Not 60, but a majority. So the majority thwarted from even bringing these up and debating them and even letting people offer amendments. Now, it used to be that if a senator opposed a bill, he or she would engage in a spirited debate, try to change people's minds, attempt to persuade the public, offer amendments, vote no, and then try to hold members who voted yes accountable at the ballot box. Isn't that what it's about? In contrast, today, to quote former Senator Charles Mathias, a Republican, in 1994, here's what he said, 1994, quote, "The filibuster has become an epidemic." That was 1994. "Used whenever a coalition can find 41 votes to oppose legislation. The distinction," Senator Mathias went on, "between voting against legislation and blocking a vote, between opposing and obstructing, has nearly disappeared," end quote. Now, when Senator Mathias spoke and described it as an epidemic, in that Congress there were 80 motions to end filibusters, a number that pales in comparison to today when we said 380 motions to end filibusters. Now, to grind this body to a halt, all the minority party has to do is resort to the filibuster, often in stealth, in order to block a motion to proceed. On critical jobs legislation, all the minority party had to do was block the motion to proceed. Then you turn around and blame the majority for failing to address the jobs crisis. We had jobs bills, but we couldn't get them up. We had jobs bills, but then what they do is they say, well, they blamed us for failing to address the jobs crisis. So it's no surprise that Americans are fed up with their broken government. As those lists of blocked bills demonstrates, the anger is fully justified. In too many critical areas, what people see is a dysfunctional Congress unable to respond effectively to the urgent challenges we face. As the Des Moines Register recently noted, quote, "One message candidates heard from voters this election was contempt for partisan gridlock in Congress. One of the biggest obstacles to congressional action is the profusion of filibusters in the United States Senate," end quote. It's no surprise that editorials throughout the country have recognized that the use of the filibuster must be changed. USA Today has noted that, quote, "The filibuster has become destructively routine." The Roanoke Times noted that, quote, "Filibuster reform alone will not fix everything that is wrong with Washington, but it would remove one of the chief impediments to governing." The Minnesota Star Tribune stated that most Americans live under the impression that representative democracy's basic precept is that the majority will rule. Sadly, that's no longer the case in the U.S. Senate, where the minority party has so abused the filibuster that the minority now controls the action, or more accurately, the inaction. This perverts the will of the voters and should not be allowed to stand, end quote. Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that copies of these editorials and others from around the country in support of filibuster reform be inserted into the record.
Without objection.
At issue in this debate is a principle at the heart of our representative democracy. Hamilton, Alexander Hamilton, the Federalist Paper number 22. "The fundamental maxim of Republican government requires that the sense of the majority should prevail." Now, the framers, to be sure, put in place important checks to temper pure majority rule. For example, the Bill of Rights protects fundamental rights and liberties. The framers, moreover, imposed structural requirements. For example, to become a law, a bill must pass both houses of Congress identical. Then it's subject to the president's veto power. And then, of course, there's always the courts and the Supreme Court to rule on the constitutionality of legislation. The Senate itself is a check on pure majority rule. As James Madison said, again, the use, and this is to quote Madison, "The use of the Senate is to consist in its proceeding with more coolness, with more system, with more wisdom than the popular branch," meaning the House of Representatives. To achieve this purpose, citizens from the smallest states have the same number of senators as citizens of the largest states, which I commented on earlier. Further, senators elected every 6 years, not every 2 years. These provisions in the Constitution are ample to protect minority rights and to restrain pure majority rule. What is not necessary, what was never intended, is an extra constitutional empowerment of the minority through a de facto requirement that a supermajority of senators be needed to even consider a bill or nominee, let alone enact a measure or confirm an individual for office. As I said earlier, the Constitution was expressly framed and ratified to correct the glaring defects of the Articles of Confederation. The Articles of Confederation required a two-thirds supermajority to pass any law and unanimous consent of all states to ratify any amendment. But we know that the experience under the Articles of Confederation was a dismal failure, one that crippled the national government, and the framers were determined to remedy those defects under our new Constitution. It is not surprising that the founders specifically rejected the idea that more than a majority would be needed for most decisions. In fact, the framers were very clear, crystal clear, about when a supermajority is needed. 5 times, spelled out clearly in the Constitution: ratification of a treaty, the override of a veto, votes of impeachment, passage of a constitutional amendment, and the expulsion of a member. Expressly pointed out in the Constitution. It should be clear, I think, especially to those who worship at the shrine of, quote, original intent, that if the framers wanted a supermajority for moving legislation or confirming a nominee, they would have done so. They would have written it in there. Yet not only did they not do so, until 1806, the Senate had a rule that allowed for a motion for the previous question. That goes back to the British Parliament. It permitted a majority to stop debate and bring up an immediate vote. It was Aaron Burr, Vice President Aaron Burr, as he was leaving the Senate, and they were reforming the rules, said, you know, this is never used. We might as well do away with it because no one ever uses it anyway. And so they did away with the motion for the previous question. But the point being that the first Congresses and the first Senate enacted that. They had that motion for the previous question. The founders, I think, were very clear why a supermajority requirement was not included. As Hamilton explained, a supermajority requirement would mean that a small minority could, quote, destroy the energy of government, end quote. That's what Madison said. A supermajority would mean that a small minority could, quote, destroy the energy of government. Government would, in Hamilton's words, be subject to, quote, caprice or artifices of an insignificant, turbulent, or corrupt junta. James Madison, as I said, he said this: it would no longer be the majority that would rule, the power would be transferred to the minority. Federalist Paper number 58. James Madison, sort of the author of our Constitution, when he said, no, you can't have a supermajority. If you do that, then the minority would rule. Power would be transferred to the minority. Unfortunately, Madison's warning has come true. In the Senate today, the United States Senate, the minority, not the majority, controls. In today's Senate, American democracy is turned on its head. The minority rules, the majority is blocked. The majority has responsibility and accountability, but the majority lacks the power to govern. The minority has the power, but lacks accountability and responsibility. This means that the minority can block bills and prevent confirmation of officials and then turn around and blame the majority for not solving the nation's problems. The minority can block popular legislation and then accuse the majority of being ineffective. I firmly believe we need to restore the tradition of majority rule to the Senate. Elections, I believe, should have consequences. And that's why I developed my plan, as I said, almost 20 years ago, to amend the standing rules to permit a decreasing majority of senators over a period of days to invoke cloture on a given matter. Again, I believe it's clear in our history of the Senate and of the framers of the Constitution. There's the story, of course, that's been told many times, maybe an apocryphal story, I don't know, that Thomas Jefferson, of course, was not here for the drafting of the Constitution. He was in France. He came back home, looked at the Constitution. He was having breakfast with George Washington. And as the story goes, Jefferson was upset about this Senate. he looked upon it as another House of Lords. And so he asked Washington why he allowed such a thing to happen, that this Senate would be created. Washington supposedly said to him, well, why did you pour your tea into the saucer? And Jefferson said, why, to cool it down. And Washington reportedly said, just so. That's why we created the Senate. Cool things down. To slow down legislation. Apart from that popular body over there, so that there could be more sober second look at things. What Washington, as far as I know, did not say was, well, we created the Senate to be a trash can in which things could just be killed and stopped. It was the idea that things could be slowed down. We could deliberate. Senator George Hoar noted in 1897, the framers designed the Senate to be a deliberative form in which, quote, the sober second thought of the people might find expression. That's what the Senate was supposed to be about. But at the end of ample debate, and with the rights for the minority to be able to offer amendments and have them voted on, the majority should be allowed to act. An up or down vote on legislation or a nominee. In this way, we can restore this body to one where government can actually function and where we can actually legislate. I think this plan also has another advantage. Recently, the minority leader defended the abuse of the filibuster on the grounds that it forces the majority to compromise and to, quote, to resolve the great issues of the moment in the middle. I strongly disagree with the minority leader. Right now, the fact is, because of the abuse of the filibuster, the minority has no incentive to compromise. Why should they? They can stop it. They have the power to block legislation without even coming to the floor to explain themselves. In such a world, as we have seen over the past few years, why would the minority come to the table to cut a deal? Now, I showed you the list of all the legislation that they blocked in the last couple of years. There wasn't any overture from the minority to compromise. They just said, we're going to kill it. You're not going to bring it up. The DREAM Act, for example. What were those other bills that I had here? The DREAM Act and the other ones that I showed that we wanted to bring up. Here's the list again. Now, the DREAM Act. Well, did the Republicans say, oh, we'll stop it, but now we want to compromise and work something out? No, they just killed it. The Bring Jobs Home Act, just kill it. The Paycheck Fairness Act, just kill it. Creating American Jobs and Ending Offshoring Act, just kill it. There was no real attempt to compromise. They didn't have to compromise. Now, in contrast, under my proposal, where you would have 60 votes at the beginning, and if you didn't have 60 votes, you would file another cloture petition, wait 3 days, you have another vote, then you'd have 57 votes you'd need. And then if you didn't get 57, you could file another cloture petition, then you'd wait 3 days, you get 54 votes. If you didn't get that, wait 3 more days, file another cloture petition, you only need 51 votes. Now, this would be a period of about 16 days, plus 30 hours of debate that would be allowed under my proposal. Now, here's why that would lead to true compromise. The minority wants the right to offer amendments, to be heard on a bill. Understand that, they should have that right. The most important thing to the majority leader, whether Republican or Democrat, whoever the majority leader may be, the most important thing to the majority leader is time on the floor. So, someone gets a bill, it's filibustered by the minority, they have a cloture vote, and let's say there's only 53 votes for it. Well, the minority knows that at some point, this bill is going to come to the floor. We'll get a vote on it. The majority leader knows that, well, that'll happen, but it's going to chew up a couple of weeks' time. The most important thing to the majority leader is time. So the majority leader would like to collapse that time. The minority leader would like to have the right to offer amendments, and therein is the compromise. So the minority leader would come and say, we offer these amendments, we'll collapse the time, we want these amendments, if not, we'll chew up a couple of weeks' time. That provokes compromise. But when one side knows that with 41 votes they can absolutely trash can something, why should they compromise if they've got the 41 votes? Now again, I want to emphasize another fact about my proposal. The Republicans have stated that filibusters are necessary because Democrats increasingly employ procedural maneuvers to deprive them of the right to offer amendments. Now, I want you to know I am sympathetic to that argument. That's why in the last Congress I included in my resolution guaranteed rights to offer germane amendments, filed in advance of the cloture vote so that everyone knows what's coming. The right, the inherent right of the minority to offer those amendments. Unfortunately, of course, every Republican voted against my proposal, and that is because Republicans currently want the best of both worlds, the right to offer non-germane amendments and the right to obstruct. And this doesn't make sense. Now, again, no one should be fooled. The fact is that the radicals who now hold sway in the Republican Party are not concerned with making the government or the Senate function better. That's because the current use of the filibuster has nothing to do with ensuring minority rights to debate and deliberation or the right to amend. Otherwise, they could support either one of these proposals, either mine or Senator Merkley's or Senator Udall's. Nor have I ever heard one Republican come to the floor and unequivocally state that if the majority leader stopped filling the amendment tree, they would routinely vote for cloture, even if they oppose the underlying bill. I've not heard one of them say that. Because the current use of the filibuster has nothing to do with minority rights. It has everything to do with obstruction, hijacking democracy, and a pure power grab designed to nullify elections in which the Republic has rejected the minority's ideas, placed them in the minority so the majority could act. The minority leader, I must say, has been frank about this approach to governing. In a speech about a balanced budget amendment, he said the following. Listen to this. This is our minority leader. Quote, "The time has come for a balanced budget amendment that forces Washington to balance its books. The Constitution must be amended to keep the government in check. We've tried persuasion, we've tried negotiations, we've tried elections. Nothing has worked." End quote. Think about that. In other words, when democracy doesn't work, what's the minority leader want? The ability to undermine the majority from acting in the United States Senate. Imagine that. We've tried elections, and the elections didn't go their way. So if they've tried elections, oh, well, they don't do that, then we got to do something else. It seems to me the ballot box ought to be determinative of really what kind of government we have. Republicans have repeatedly filibustered motions to proceed. How can you offer amendments or try to improve a bill if you can't even bring it up? They filibustered executive and judicial branch nominees. Now, of course, nominations can't be amended. Again, belying the argument that many Republicans use that they're just filibustering because of filling the tree. Well, there's no tree when it comes to nominations. Now, Mr. President, I want to now emphasize something. I have been saying all along to Republicans and how they have been using the filibuster. I want to state unequivocally, the Democrats don't come to this with clean hands, I can tell you. It's been both sides. It depends on who's in the majority and who's in the minority. That's all it depends on. And as I said earlier, when I first brought this up in the 1990s, I warned then of an escalating arms race. I've been in the Senate long enough to have 5 different changes in the Senate between majority and minority. And every single time, the number of filibusters goes up. Every time. Democrats say to Republicans, well, you know, you filibustered 30 times last Congress. We're now in power. We'll filibuster you 60 times. And the Democrats get kicked out, and Republicans come back and they say, they did it to us 60 times, we'll do it to them 100 times. And on and on and on. It's like an arms race. So I think any time I have used the word Republican generically, you could just substitute minority. I don't care which minority, Democrats or Republicans. Doesn't make any difference. The minority in the Senate should not have the absolute power to trash can something. It should have the power to slow things down, to debate, to amend, to deliberate. But eventually, the majority, the people here who the people at the ballot box in this country have put in charge to govern, should at some point be allowed to govern. If I'm in the minority, all I want is the right to be able to debate, have my views heard, offer amendments. I might also say this, Mr. President, the right of the minority is not to win. The minority doesn't have the right to win, but it sure has the right to offer amendments and to be heard and to be able to try to sway people. I've been here in the Senate when we've had amendments, and amazingly enough, you get some Republicans and some Democrats, and it passes, even though some Democrats and some Republicans opposed it. That very rarely happens any longer today. So again, I've been talking mostly about Republicans generically. That's because they're in the minority now. I said the same thing about Democrats when the Democrats were in the minority. Now, this is not a minority right. It's nothing less than a formula for tyranny by the minority. Now, who said that? That was Senator Frist, Republican leader, again in November of 2004. When he was in the majority and we were in the minority, this filibuster is nothing less than a formula for tyranny by the minority. You know what? He was right. Again, it just depends on who's in the minority and who's in the majority. That's why we've got to make a change. It could be Democrats, it could be Republicans, it could be even a bipartisan coalition if there's a minority, small minority. As I said, I don't think there's anything radical about what I've introduced. As I noted, the filibuster is not in the Constitution. It was rejected by the founders. There's nothing sacred about requiring 60 votes to end debate. The Senate has adopted rules and laws that forbid the filibuster in numerous circumstances. Get that. This Senate has adopted rules that forbid the filibuster in certain cases. The budget cannot be filibustered. War powers cannot be filibustered. International trade acts, imagine that. International trade acts cannot be filibustered. Congressional Review Act, disapproval of regulations, cannot be filibustered. So, if the filibuster is so sacred, why have we carved out exceptions for international trade acts? Moreover, Article 1, Section 5, Clause 2 of the Constitution, the Rules of Proceedings Clause specifies, quote, each House may determine the rules of its proceedings, end quote. Again, my resolution, far from being unprecedented, stands squarely in the tradition of updating Senate rules as appropriate to foster a more effective and functioning legislature. For example, beginning in 1917, the Senate has passed 4 significant amendments to its standing rules, the latest in 1975, to narrow or to shape the filibuster. In 1979, Senator Robert Byrd made clear that the Constitution allows a majority of the Senate to change its rules. He said, and I quote, "The Constitution in Article 1, Section 5 says that each House shall determine the rules of its proceedings. Now we are at the beginning of a Congress. This Congress," Senator Byrd said, "is not obliged to be bound by the dead hand of the past. It is my belief, which has been supported by rulings of vice presidents of both parties and by votes of the Senate, in essence, upholding the power and the right of a majority of the Senate to change the rules of the Senate at the beginning of a new Congress," end quote. This Congress is not obliged to be bound by the dead hand of the past, Senator Robert Byrd. Now, he said that. Power and right of a majority of the Senate to change the rules of the Senate at the beginning of a new Congress. Again, this was also the opinion of the Republican Party. As I mentioned, in 2005, the Republican Policy Committee, chaired by our former colleague Senator Kyle, stated, and I quote, "The Senate has always had and repeatedly has exercised the constitutional power to change the Senate's procedures through a majority vote. That's a statement from the Republican Policy Committee, 2005. Now, again, those who say this is some kind of nuclear option, blow up the Senate, put all these terms about nuclear option and stuff, no, it's not a nuclear option. As Senator Byrd said, and as Senator Kyl said, the Senate has always had and repeatedly has exercised the constitutional power to change the Senate's procedures through a majority vote. There are those now, I must admit, some in my own party on this side of the aisle in the Senate, who say that in order to change the rules, we have to have a two-thirds vote. Now, why is that? Well, because some Senate in the past set down the rules, and they said in order to change these rules, you need a two-thirds vote. Are we bound by that dead hand of the past? Not at all. Not at all. Each new Congress, each time the Senate convenes and when a new Congress forms, can by majority vote change its own rules. So it's not a nuclear option at all. Now, to be very clear, I opposed the Frist motion at that time in 2005, and I made it clear why. Because they were attempting to change the rules in the middle of a Congress. Now, while I believe let me see that Byrd quote again. While I believe that the Congress has the power, the Senate, here. Well, I'm sorry, it's not Byrd, it was a Republican Policy Committee. Said, so you see, it's at the beginning of a Congress, as Senator Byrd said. Is my belief, which has been supported by rulings of vice presidents of both parties and by votes of the Senate, upholding the power and right of a majority of the Senate to change the rules of the Senate at the beginning of a new Congress. I mean, you can't go changing the rules every other week. How do you know what's going to happen? But at the beginning of a Congress, every 2 years, the Senate has the right by majority vote, set down the rules, and you operate by those rules for 2 years. What Senator Frist was trying to do was to change it in the middle of the game. Well, if you go down that pathway, my goodness, the majority could change the rules next week and then the week after and do it one time 1 week and 1 week the next. How would you ever know what the rules of the road were? That's why the only reason I opposed the Frist motion at that time is because it was changing it in the middle of a Congress. Mr. President, here's a letter from numerous constitutional scholars, including Charles Fried, Solicitor General under President Reagan, Michael McConnell, a former federal judge nominated by President George W. Bush. These scholars make clear that at the beginning of a new Congress, a majority of the Senate can change its rules. Here's the letter. It reads in part. Some, however, have sought to elevate the debate to constitutional dimensions by suggesting that it is institutionally improper for a new Senate to alter the Senate's rules by majority vote, because the internal procedures adopted by prior Senates have required a two-thirds majority to allow a vote on a motion to alter the rules. With respect, such a concern confuses the power to change the Senate rules during a session with the unquestioned constitutional power of each incoming Senate to fix its own rules unencumbered by the decisions of past Senates. The standing two-thirds requirement for altering the Senate's rules is a sensible effort at preventing changes to the rules in the midst of a game. It cannot, however, prevent the Senate at the beginning of a new game from adopting rules deemed necessary to permit the just, efficient, and orderly operations of the 113th Senate. We agree. Again, this is the letter from Charles Fried, Solicitor General under President Reagan, Michael McConnell, a former federal judge nominated by President George W. Bush. Goes on, it says, we agree with the overwhelming consensus of the academic community that no pre-existing internal procedural rule can limit the constitutional authority of each new Senate to determine by majority vote its own rules of procedure. One more time, we agree with the overwhelming consensus of the academic community that no pre-existing internal procedural rule can limit the constitutional authority of each new Senate to determine by majority vote its own rules of procedure. That's very profound. So it's not just me as a Democrat. Here are two Republicans, very prominent Republicans, saying the same thing. The last significant rule change I might point out was in 1975, when the votes necessary for cloture was set at 60. There's only one member of the Senate today, Senator Leahy, who was in the Senate in 1975, to vote on that current version of Rule 22. No one else was here then. We've had how many different Senates since that time? And yet, that dead hand of the past continues to rule. Mr. President, I want to emphasize that I firmly believe that amending the standing rules is necessary. Informal agreements are insufficient to return the Senate to functionality. We had this last time, sort of a handshake, an agreement to make the Senate a better institution through fewer filibusters and procedural delays, et cetera, et cetera. Well, I think looking back over the last 2 years, I don't think the gentleman's agreement was very effective. Mr. President, the minority leader recently stated that the reforms being advocated by me and others are being done with, quote, the purpose of consolidating power and further marginalizing the minority voice, end quote. Nothing can be further from the truth. I want to be clear. The reforms I advocate are not about one party or one agenda gaining an unfair advantage. It's about the Senate as an institution operating more fairly, effectively, and democratically. Those of us who went to law school all remember that if you come into the court of equity, you have to come in with clean hands. Well, I hope that I have clean hands since I first offered this when I was in the minority. I was in the minority. And again, I would point out, it belies belief that sometime in the future, Democrats won't be in the minority again. It's going to happen, and it should. No one party should rule here for long periods of time. We need to have that kind of change. But what we need is the ability of whoever is in the majority to be able to govern. That's what the people elected them to do. Well, the truth is we do not function here. We do not function in the way that we were supposed to under the Constitution. And it's something that both Democrats and Republicans should care about. What was never envisioned and what should not be allowed to continue is a system where bills are even prevented from being debated, or the idea that a small minority can block legislation or nominees without even coming to the floor to explain themselves. Now, finally, Mr. President, there's one other red herring that keeps coming up, and that is that somehow the reform that I'm proposing, or any reform, will somehow make the Senate like the House. I hear that from members of my side of the aisle. Oh, we'll just become like the House of Representatives. I have to ask the question, since when did the Senate become defined by Rule 22, the cloture rule? Why does that define the United States Senate? It seems to me the Senate was defined in the Constitution, where we have 2 senators from every state, small and large, where we're elected every 6 years, not every 2, where the Senate has certain functions on treaties, on nominations, that the House of Representatives doesn't have, and where the Constitution is very clear. There are 5 times when the Senate must have a supermajority to act. Now, again, I would point out that the Senate will, by its very nature, even under my reform proposal or that by Mr. Udall or Mr. Merkley, would still operate based on unanimous consent. And each senator will continue to understand that maintaining good relationships with all senators, working hard to become experts in issues, Drafting legislation and amendments will remain the essence of what it means to be a senator, not the ability to filibuster. So to those who say we'll become more like the House, I say, no, that's not going to happen. They say, well, it could. Well, sure it could. Some future Senate could wipe out all the rules. Now, they couldn't do away with the constitutional aspect. They couldn't make us elected every 2 years, for example, or take away the function of the Senate in terms of treaties and impeachments and things like that. Sure, any future Congress can change the rules. But I think because of the nature of the Senate, the way it's established, because of the way it is set in the Constitution, 2 from every state, not popularly elected every 2 years, means that senators will have to work with one another. They'll have to, again, exhibit that kind of comity. C-O-M-I-T-Y, not comedy, comity, of recognizing that each senator should have the right to amend, to debate, to discuss, to question, to offer amendments. Again, we're told that somehow the filibuster, this idea of the filibuster defines the Senate. Again, until 1970, there was approximately 1 filibuster per Congress. Did anyone ever suggest then that because there was not the rampant abuse of the filibuster, that the Senate was no different than the House? Was the Senate of Clay and Wagner, of Vandenberg, of Johnson and Taft just another House of Representatives? Were the giants of the Senate who came before us, the Daniel Websters, Henry Clays, the Robert Tafts, the Hubert Humphreys, were they any less a senator because they were not defined by a de facto 60-vote supermajority requirement? Mr. President, I believe the Senate should embrace George Washington's vision of this body, if that story is true about him and Jefferson and the saucer and the tea. The Senate was set up to slow things down, to ensure proper debate and deliberation. That is what the founders intended. That's what we've advocated, and that's what I advocate. We will not become the House. As one author has noted, however, the increasing use of the filibuster has converted the Senate from the saucer George Washington intended into a deep freeze and a dead weight. At the heart of this debate is a central question. Do we believe in democracy? Republicans, and sadly many of my colleagues in my own caucus, repeatedly warn about advancing these reforms because Democrats will find ourselves in the minority one day, and we may want to stop something. Well, I'm sorry, I don't fear democracy. If the people of this country at the ballot box put the Republicans in charge of the Senate, the Republicans ought to have the right to govern. We should have the right to be able to offer amendments and debate and deliberate, but we should not have the right to absolutely obstruct what the majority is doing. Issues of public policy should be decided at the ballot box, not by the manipulation of archaic procedural rules. The truth is, neither party should be afraid of majority rule, afraid of allowing a majority of the people's representative to work its will. After ample protections for minority rights, the majority in the Senate, whether Democratic or Republican or a bipartisan coalition, duly elected by the American people, should be allowed to carry out its agenda, to govern, and to be held accountable at the ballot box. I want to conclude by noting that it's often said, and it is true, that the power of a senator comes not by what we can do, but by what we can stop. And that's true. The Senate is a body in which one individual senator has an enormous amount of power to stop things. And no one wants to give up that power. But I believe it's time for for us to take a look at ourselves. For the good of the Senate, and more importantly, for the good of the country, we need to give up a little bit of that power. Not all of it, but a little bit of it. I'm willing to give it up. All senators should have fundamental confidence in democracy and the good sense of the American people. We must have confidence in our ability to make our case to the people and to prevail at the ballot box. We must not be afraid of democracy. I'm not afraid of it. I quite frankly believe that my ideas, my support of certain measures is more widely supported by the American people than my friends on the other side of the aisle. They believe just the opposite. That's good. And that's the way that we should operate here in the mortar, grinding legislation out. And then at the ballot box every 2 years, healthy debates about the direction of the country and which way we should go. We should have the confidence. Republicans should have their own confidence, and we should have our own confidence in our ability to make our case to the people and to prevail at the ballot box. Don't be afraid. Don't be afraid of the American people and then their inherent ability to make wise and just decisions. Oh, things may go awry one time or another time. But in the great history of our country, the American people, as Winston Churchill once said, after we tried everything else, we always do the right thing. We do. The American people make the right decisions. Sometimes I may not agree with it, but then it's my business to go out and try to convince my constituents and others that they made the wrong choice, that we should be going in a different direction. That's the essence of democracy, not the power of me, a senator from Iowa, to be able to stop what the majority wants to do. Not me just with a handful of other people saying, I don't care what they want to do, we can stop it. Put it in the trash can. All I want is the right to debate, to discuss, to be able to offer amendments that are germane to the legislation. So again, I'm not afraid of living with these reforms, both as a majority and as a member of the minority party, which I'm sure that we will once again become at some point in the future. So, Mr. President, as I have over the last, I guess it makes 17 years now, come to the floor, I know that my proposal will not win. Well, it hasn't thus far. That's all right. A lot of times people say, why do you offer it? You know you're going to lose. I offer it because I believe so deeply in this. And I believe that sometimes you just got to stand up for what you believe in. And you've got to make your case as forcefully, as intelligently as possible. I hope I have done that, both in my words and in my written statement and in the past debates that I've had on this Senate floor that occur about every 2 years when the Senate convenes. I don't carry this on beyond the first day of legislative business. I don't think we should. I think we set the rules down on the first day. After that, I don't think we should be changing the rules in the middle of the game. But we're still in the first legislative day, and I think now is the time to do this. Now, Mr. President, before I yield the floor, I know that our distinguished majority leader and the minority leader have been working hard on some reforms on the filibuster. I'm not privy to all of that. I don't know exactly all of the details of it. It was discussed in our policy conference caucus today. I will say this about at least what I understand to be the essence of the reforms that our majority leader has worked so hard on, and that is that it's better than what we have right now. I think it is, from what I understand. I don't know all of the details, but from what I understand, it is a step in the right direction. I want to make it clear that I might vote for it. As soon as I find out exactly what it all is, I might vote for it because it's probably better than what we got right now. But I just want to be clear that my vote for that does not signify that I prefer that over doing away with this absolute 60-vote threshold. Because as under the reform rules that I understand that's being promulgated by the majority leader and minority leader, we still have a 60-vote threshold on anything, except for the motion to proceed. So any amendment, any bill, you still have 60 votes. so a small group, a handful, can still put bills and amendments and everything else in the trash can. I just fundamentally disagree with that. So if I do vote for that, and like I said, I probably will because it looks like it might be better than what we got right now, and I know it's tough. I do not denigrate for 1 minute the effort and the work of the majority leader and the minority leader in trying to reach these agreements. These are tough things. I just think that we have to be more forthright and constantly, every 2 years, go after this idea that somehow this dead hand of the past that says we need 2/3 vote to change the rules, that somehow that controls us. It shouldn't. It doesn't control us. That somehow we have to adhere to this 60 vote threshold forever. That shouldn't control us. Every 2 years, according to the Constitution, according to Senator Byrd, according to constitutional scholars of both parties, we have the constitutional right at the beginning of a Congress to change our rules with a majority vote. That's what we ought to be about doing. So, Mr. President, I look forward to seeing the proposed rules reform that the majority leader and minority leader have been working on. Again, I know it's tough to work these things out, but I think this body has to move ahead and do away with that dead hand of the past and provide for rules changes that allow us to function, allow the majority to act with the right of the minority to debate, to slow things down, to amend, not the right to win. I've never said the minority ought to have the right to win. The minority ought to have the right to make their voice and their votes heard in this body. That's what my proposal would do. Again, as I said, I don't expect it to win, but I want people to be able to express themselves if they feel that we should move in that direction. And I offer it in that vein. But I know that there are those that feel that somehow that 2/3 vote, we have to abide by this dead hand of the past. I just don't believe so. Again, Mr. President, with that, I yield the floor.